On June 4th, 1944, 2 days before D-Day, a German naval commander in Normandy sent an encrypted message to Berlin. The message said, based on intercepted Allied communications, "We believe the invasion will come at Calais, not Normandy. Deploy reserves accordingly." In a bunker beneath London, British codebreakers read that message within minutes. They knew the German commander was wrong. They knew the invasion was coming to Normandy in 48 hours. And they did nothing. They let the Germans believe their own lie, because revealing they could read German messages would have been worse than letting the invasion plan remain at risk. This is the story of the greatest intelligence triumph in history. How the Allies broke Germany's Enigma code, read virtually every German military message for 3 years, and somehow kept that secret from an enemy that was absolutely convinced their encryption was mathematically unbreakable. And how that one secret, more than any battle, more than any weapon, helped win World War II. To understand how extraordinary this achievement was, you need to understand what Enigma was. Not just a machine, but a mathematical fortress. The Germans genuinely believed, that breaking Enigma was impossible. Not difficult, impossible. And they had good reasons for that belief. Very good reasons. The Enigma machine was invented in 1918 by a German engineer named Arthur Scherbius. He designed it as a commercial encryption device for banks and businesses. The machine looked like a typewriter, about the size of a portable typewriter actually. It had a keyboard, a lamp board where encrypted letters would light up, and most importantly, a set of rotors. Those rotors were the heart of the system. Here's how it worked. You'd type a letter on the keyboard. The electrical signal would pass through 3 rotors, each one scrambling the letter in a different way. Then the signal would hit a reflector and bounce back through the rotors again, taking a different path. Finally, a different letter would light up on the lamp board. That was your encrypted letter. The person receiving the message would have their own Enigma machine set to the same starting configuration, the same rotor settings, and they'd type in the encrypted message. The machine would reverse the process and reveal the original text. Now, here's what made it seem unbreakable. The rotors had 26 positions each, one for each letter of the alphabet. Every time you typed a letter, the rotors advanced, changing the encryption pattern. So the letter A might encrypt to X the first time, to M the second time, to Q the third time. The pattern changed with every single keystroke, and with 3 rotors, the number of possible settings was astronomical. Over 17,000 different starting positions just for the rotors, and that's before you factor in the plug board, which added another layer of scrambling. The German military modified the commercial Enigma, making it even more complex. They added more rotors, more settings, more scrambling. By the time World War II started, military Enigma machines had so many possible configurations that the German cryptographers calculated it would take longer than the age of the universe to try every combination. Even if you had 1,000 people working around the clock, you couldn't break it by brute force. The math was on Germany's side, or so they thought. Let me tell you about the man who proved them wrong, Alan Turing. 27 years old in 1939, when Britain declared war on Germany. Mathematical genius, awkward, socially uncomfortable, brilliant in a way that most people couldn't comprehend. Turing had been working on theoretical mathematics before the war, abstract concepts about computation and logic. But when war came, British intelligence recruited him. They needed mathematicians. They needed people who could think about codes, about patterns, about impossible problems. Turing was sent to Bletchley Park, a mansion about 50 miles north of London. That's where British codebreakers were working on the Enigma problem. And it was a problem. The Poles had made some progress before the war started. Polish mathematicians had actually built a replica of an Enigma machine and figured out some of the basic principles. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Polish codebreakers escaped to France and shared everything they knew with the British and French. That Polish work was crucial. It gave the British a starting point. But starting point wasn't enough. The German military Enigma was more complex than what the Poles had worked on, and even with the Polish insights, breaking Enigma seemed impossible. That's where Turing came in. Turing looked at the problem differently. Everyone else was trying to figure out the rotor settings by analysing the mathematics. Turing realised that wasn't going to work. There were too many possibilities. Instead, he focused on a weakness in how the Germans used Enigma, and that weakness was human nature. Here's the thing. Enigma was mathematically sound, but the people using it made mistakes. German radio operators developed habits, patterns, and Turing realized that if you could identify those patterns, you could narrow down the possible settings. You didn't need to check all 17,000 starting positions. You only needed to check the ones that were consistent with the patterns you'd identified. Turing designed a machine to do this. He called it the Bombe, based on the earlier Polish design called the Bomba. The Bombe was electromechanical, not electronic, but it was still impressive. It was about 7 feet tall, 8 feet wide, weighed over a ton. It had rotating drums that mimicked Enigma rotors. You'd feed it encrypted messages, and it would test thousands of possible settings, looking for contradictions. When it found a setting that produced German words, it would stop. Then human operators would take over, fine-tuning the settings until they cracked that day's messages. Because here's another critical point. The Germans changed Enigma settings every day at midnight. Every day, German operators would receive new rotor positions, new plugboard settings. They'd set their machines accordingly, and every day, Bletchley Park had to break Enigma all over again. It wasn't like breaking it once solved the problem forever. They had to break it daily. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they didn't, but over time, they got faster. By mid-1941, Bletchley Park was reading German Enigma messages regularly. Not all of them. Some German networks used more complex settings that took longer to break, but many messages, especially German Air Force and Navy messages, they were reading those within hours of them being sent, sometimes within minutes. Now, imagine what this meant. Imagine being Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, and being told that your codebreakers can read German military communications, that you can see German battle plans, that you know where U-boats are operating, that you can read messages from the German High Command. That's like playing poker and being able to see your opponent's cards. It's an overwhelming advantage. But here's the catch. You can't let the Germans know you can read their cards, because the moment they suspect Enigma is broken, they'll change the system. They'll add more rotors, change procedures, maybe abandon Enigma entirely and use something new. And then your advantage disappears. So Churchill and his intelligence chiefs faced a terrible decision. They could use the intelligence they were getting from Enigma, but they had to use it carefully. They couldn't act on every message. They had to let some German operations succeed, even when they knew about them in advance, just to protect the secret. They had to let people die to keep the Germans believing Enigma was secure. Let me give you a specific example. Coventry, November 14, 1940. Bletchley Park decrypted German Luftwaffe messages indicating a major bombing raid was planned against Coventry that night. Churchill knew the raid was coming. He could have evacuated the city. He could have positioned extra anti-aircraft guns. He could have sent every available fighter plane to intercept the bombers. But doing any of those things would have told the Germans that Britain had advanced knowledge, and that might have made them suspicious about Enigma. So Churchill made a choice. He allowed some defensive preparations, but not enough to make it obvious that Britain knew the attack was coming. The raid happened. Over 500 German bombers attacked Coventry. They destroyed the medieval cathedral. They killed over 500 people. They wounded thousands more. And Churchill, who knew it was coming, did only the minimum to defend the city because protecting the Enigma secret was more important than protecting Coventry. That decision haunted Churchill for the rest of his life. Years later, He would say that no decision he made during the war was more difficult, but he believed it was necessary. Because if Germany discovered that Enigma was broken, the long-term cost would be far greater than one night of bombing. That's the moral complexity of intelligence work. You have perfect information, but you can't act on it perfectly, or you'll lose it. You have to let some disasters happen to prevent bigger disasters later. You have to sacrifice the few to save the many, and you have to live with those decisions forever. Now let's talk about what the Allies learned from reading Enigma. Because the intelligence was extraordinary. They learned about Operation Barbarossa, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, before it happened. They couldn't tell Stalin directly without revealing the source, but they passed warnings through other channels. Stalin ignored them, but that's a different story. They learned about German troop movements in North Africa, which helped British forces defeat Rommel. They learned about U-boat positions in the Atlantic, which allowed Allied convoys to avoid them, or, when necessary, to target specific U-boats for destruction. The Battle of the Atlantic was where Enigma intelligence had its biggest impact. German U-boats were sinking hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping every month in 1941 and 1942. Britain was being strangled. Without supplies from America, Britain couldn't survive. The U-boats were winning. But then Bletchley Park started breaking U-boat Enigma messages regularly. They could read the daily orders sent to U-boat commanders. They knew where U-boat patrol lines were positioned. They could route convoys around them. Suddenly, in late 1942 and into 1943, U-boat effectiveness dropped. Convoys were making it across the Atlantic with minimal losses. U-boats were being sunk in increasing numbers. From the German perspective, it seemed like Allied anti-submarine tactics had suddenly gotten much better. Better radar, better depth charges, better hunting techniques. The Germans never suspected the real reason. The Allies could read their mail. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German U-boat fleet, was frustrated. He kept asking his cryptographers, "Is Enigma secure? Can the enemy read our messages?" The cryptographers assured him, "No, Enigma is mathematically unbreakable, impossible to crack." Dönitz wanted to believe them, but the evidence was troubling. Convoys kept avoiding his U-boat patrol lines. British aircraft kept finding his U-boats in the middle of the Atlantic, far from any reasonable patrol routes. It seemed like the enemy had some kind of advanced knowledge, but every time Dönitz raised concerns, the German cryptographic service, the B-Dienst, ran tests. They'd analyze Enigma mathematically. They'd check for weaknesses, and every time they'd conclude that Enigma was secure. The convoys were avoiding U-boats because of improved radar, they said. The aircraft were finding U-boats because of better search patterns. It couldn't be broken codes. That was impossible. This is a beautiful example of cognitive bias. The Germans had convinced themselves that Enigma was unbreakable, so when evidence suggested it might be broken, they found alternative explanations. They couldn't accept that their supposedly perfect system had failed. Their arrogance, their overconfidence in their own technology, blinded them to the truth, and the Allies did everything possible to reinforce that German confidence. When they sank a U-boat based on Enigma intelligence, they'd always send a reconnaissance aircraft over the area afterward. Then they'd report that the aircraft spotted the U-boat and directed the attack. The Germans would think, it was the aircraft, not broken codes. When they rerouted a convoy around a U-boat patrol line, they'd occasionally have the convoy radio back to Britain in a code they knew Germany could break, asking for instructions. The Germans would think, they're navigating by radio communications, not reading our messages. It was elaborate theatre. Every action based on Enigma intelligence had to be disguised as something else. British intelligence created an entire system for this. They called it Ultra, the classification level for Enigma-derived intelligence. Only a handful of people in the military and government knew about Ultra. Field commanders would receive intelligence without being told where it came from. They'd be told, a reliable source indicates that, or reconnaissance suggests that. They wouldn't know the source was enemy communications being read in real time. Let me tell you about a naval battle that illustrates this perfectly. The Battle of Cape Matapan, March 1941. The British Mediterranean Fleet was searching for an Italian naval force. The Italians were planning to attack British convoys near Greece. Bletchley Park intercepted and decrypted German messages to the Italian Navy, messages sent via Enigma, describing the Italian fleet's position and plans. The British fleet altered course to intercept, but they couldn't just sail directly to the Italian position. That would be too obvious. So they sent out reconnaissance aircraft first. The aircraft discovered the Italian fleet and reported its position. Then the British fleet changed course based on the reconnaissance report. They intercepted the Italians at night and sank 3 cruisers. The Italians never suspected that the British had known their position all along. They thought it was bad luck that a reconnaissance aircraft spotted them. This kind of deception happened over and over. Every use of ultra-intelligence required a cover story, and the cover stories had to be believable. Sometimes that meant creating elaborate fake operations. Sometimes it meant sacrificing smaller objectives to protect the larger secret. The whole war became a chess game played on multiple levels. The visible level, where actual battles happened, and the invisible level, where intelligence shaped those battles while pretending not to exist. Now, let's talk about the close calls, the times when Germany almost discovered that Enigma was broken, because there were several moments when the secret nearly came out. February 1942, German U-boat headquarters changed procedures. They added a 4th rotor to naval Enigma machines. Suddenly, Bletchley Park couldn't read U-boat messages anymore. The bomb machines couldn't handle 4 rotors. For 10 months, from February to December 1942, the Allies were blind to U-boat movements, and immediately, U-boat effectiveness increased. Convoy losses spiked. It was a crisis. British intelligence worked frantically to break 4-rotor Enigma. They built new, more powerful bomber machines. They pushed their mathematicians to find new methods, and they got lucky. In October 1942, the Royal Navy captured a German U-boat, U-599, off the coast of Egypt. On board were Enigma materials, including settings for the 4-rotor machine. That capture, combined with new bomb machines, allowed Bletchley Park to break 4-rotor Enigma by December 1942. But here's the thing. When the Allies captured U-599, they had to be incredibly careful. They couldn't let Germany know it had been captured. So the Royal Navy arranged for the submarine to sink mysteriously after they'd removed everything of intelligence value. The Germans thought U-599 was lost in combat, not captured. They never suspected that its codebooks and Enigma machine had been taken by the enemy. Another close call came in 1943. German intelligence captured a British agent in France. Under interrogation, the agent mentioned something about British code-breaking success. The information was vague, but it was enough to raise concerns. The German security service, the Sicherheitsdienst, launched an investigation. They examined Enigma security procedures. They ran tests. They interviewed operators. For weeks, British intelligence held its breath. If the Germans concluded that Enigma was compromised, the entire Ultra program would collapse. Every advantage gained over the previous 3 years would vanish. But the investigation concluded that while some operational security procedures needed improvement, Enigma itself was secure. The captured agent's claims were dismissed as exaggeration or misinformation. The Germans still believed in the mathematical invincibility of their system. Think about what that means. Germany had evidence suggesting their codes might be broken, but they trusted their mathematics more than their evidence. They couldn't conceive that anyone could break Enigma. That overconfidence saved the Allied intelligence program. Let me tell you about the people who made this possible. Bletchley Park at its peak employed about 10,000 people. 10,000. Most were women. Young women, recruited from universities, from clerical jobs, From anywhere, the government could find people with language skills, mathematical aptitude, or just the ability to focus on tedious, detailed work for hours. These women operated the bomb machines. They transcribed intercepted German radio messages. They analyzed patterns. They cross-referenced decoded messages with other intelligence. They worked 8-hour shifts, sometimes longer, in a Victorian mansion that was freezing in winter and sweltering in summer. The work was monotonous, exhausting, and absolutely critical. And they couldn't tell anyone what they did, not their families, not their friends. They were told that discussing their work, even mentioning that they worked at Bletchley Park, could result in prosecution under the Official Secrets Act. One woman, Mavis Lever, worked as a codebreaker at Bletchley Park. She was 19 years old when she arrived in 1940. She worked on Italian naval codes initially, then helped break German Enigma variants. She was brilliant. She made breakthrough after breakthrough, and she couldn't tell anyone. She went home on leave, and her parents asked what she did. She said she was a clerk. That's all, a clerk. Her parents died, never knowing that their daughter helped win World War II. That was the deal. Everyone at Bletchley Park signed the Official Secrets Act. They promised not to reveal anything about their work, and most of them kept that promise for decades. It wasn't until the 1970s, when the British government finally declassified some information about Bletchley Park, that these people could talk about what they'd done. By then, they'd been keeping the secret for 30 years. Imagine carrying that for 30 years. Imagine doing something that helped save millions of lives, that helped win the most important war in history, and not being able to tell anyone. Not being able to explain to your family why you were away during the war. Not being able to share your accomplishments. Just living with the knowledge that you were part of something extraordinary, but it had to remain secret. Alan Turing himself struggled after the war. He couldn't talk about his work at Bletchley Park. He returned to academic mathematics. But in 1952, he was convicted under British law for homosexuality, which was illegal at the time. He was subjected to chemical castration as punishment. In 1954, he died from cyanide poisoning. The official verdict was suicide, though some have questioned that. The man who did more than almost anyone else to win World War II died in disgrace, unable to even reveal what he'd accomplished because it was still classified. Turing wasn't pardoned until 2013, 60 years after his death. By then, his contributions to mathematics, to computer science, to winning World War II were finally being recognized. But for most of his life, he was just another mathematician. Nobody knew he'd broken Enigma. Nobody knew he'd saved countless lives. That's another tragedy of secret intelligence work. The people who do it can't be celebrated, can't be recognized, their successes are classified, their failures are public, and they have to live with that asymmetry. Now, let's talk about the strategic impact. What difference did breaking Enigma actually make to the outcome of World War II? This is a question historians still debate. Some argue it shortened the war by 2 years, maybe more. Others say it was just one factor among many, but everyone agrees it was significant. Consider D-Day, the Normandy invasion in June 1944. German commanders were convinced the invasion would come at Calais, the shortest crossing point from England to France. They positioned their strongest forces there. They fortified Calais heavily. Why? Because Allied deception convinced them Calais was the target. But how did the Allies know the deception was working? They read German Enigma messages discussing the expected invasion at Calais. They knew the Germans were in the wrong place. That knowledge gave them confidence to proceed with Normandy. Without Enigma intelligence, would D-Day have succeeded? Maybe, but it would have been riskier. Casualties might have been higher. The chances of failure might have been greater. Enigma didn't guarantee success, but it stacked the odds in the Allies' favour. Or consider the Battle of the Atlantic again. In 1942, Germany was sinking Allied ships faster than they could be replaced. If that had continued, Britain would have run out of fuel, food, ammunition. The war in Europe might have ended in a negotiated peace, with Germany controlling most of the continent. But breaking U-boat Enigma messages allowed convoys to avoid U-boat patrol lines. Sinkings dropped dramatically in 1943. Britain survived. America could continue sending supplies and troops to Europe. The war continued, and Germany eventually lost. Without Enigma intelligence, that outcome wasn't guaranteed. The Battle of the Atlantic could have gone the other way. And if Britain had been forced out of the war, what then? Maybe America still defeats Japan in the Pacific, but defeating Germany without Britain as a base, that's a much harder problem. Maybe the war drags on into 1946, 1947. Maybe Germany develops nuclear weapons first. The counterfactuals are endless and disturbing. So yes, breaking Enigma mattered. It mattered enormously. But here's what I think is the most important part of this story. It's not just about the technical achievement, though that was remarkable. It's not just about the strategic impact, though that was significant. It's about the human decisions, the moral choices, the sacrifices. Churchill letting Coventry burn, Bletchley Park workers keeping secrets for decades, Turing dying in obscurity, commanders letting soldiers die when they could have saved them, all to protect the source. Those are the real costs of intelligence work, not just the technical challenges, but the moral burden. And on the German side, the arrogance, the absolute certainty that Enigma was unbreakable. That confidence killed them. If they'd been more paranoid, more suspicious, if they'd questioned their assumptions, they might have discovered the breach. They might have changed systems. They might have protected their communications, but they didn't. They trusted their mathematics. They trusted their engineers. And that trust was misplaced. There's a lesson there. Overconfidence in your own technology, in your own capabilities, can be fatal. The Germans built a system they thought was perfect. And because they thought it was perfect, they didn't question it when evidence suggested otherwise. They explained away the anomalies. They found excuses. They protected their belief system even when reality contradicted it. That's a very human failing. We all do it to some degree. We invest in an idea, a system, a belief, and then we defend it even when evidence suggests we're wrong. The Germans did that with Enigma, and it cost them the war. Meanwhile, the Allies stayed paranoid. They assumed the Germans would discover the breach any day. They prepared contingency plans. They developed alternative intelligence sources. They never got complacent. That paranoia, that constant vigilance, kept the secret safe. Let me tell you one final story. It's about a German officer named Wilhelm Tranow. He was a signals intelligence officer working on communication security. In 1943, he wrote a report analyzing Allied anti-submarine successes. He noted that convoys seemed to avoid U-boat patrol lines too often to be coincidence. He suggested that perhaps Allied intelligence had some way of reading German naval communications. Tranow's report went to Admiral Dönitz. Dönitz forwarded it to the cryptographic service for evaluation. The cryptographers dismissed it. They provided detailed mathematical proofs that Enigma couldn't be broken. They suggested that Tranow was overreacting to statistical anomalies. Dönitz accepted their assessment. Tranow's report was filed away. Wilhelm Tranow was right. The Allies were reading German messages. But nobody believed him because the mathematics said it was impossible. Tranow survived the war. In the 1970s, when the Enigma story became public, he gave interviews. He said, "I knew something was wrong, I could feel it, but I couldn't prove it, and nobody wanted to believe that our supposedly perfect system had failed, so my warnings were ignored. That's the tragedy." Germany had people smart enough to suspect the truth, but the institutional belief in Enigma's invincibility was too strong. The mathematics were too convincing, and so the warnings were dismissed, and the Allies continued reading German messages until the very end of the war. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over, and only then, slowly, did the truth about Enigma begin to emerge. The British kept it secret for years after the war. They actually gave Enigma machines to foreign governments, telling them the machines were secure. Then they'd break those countries' communications just like they'd broken Germany's. It wasn't until the 1970s that the full story became public. When German veterans learned that Enigma had been broken, that the Allies had been reading their messages for years, they were shocked. Some refused to believe it. They trusted Enigma completely. Learning that it had been compromised was like learning that the laws of mathematics had been broken. It seemed impossible. But it happened. A group of Polish mathematicians, British codebreakers, including one awkward genius named Alan Turing, broke the unbreakable code. They read German messages for 3 years, maybe more. They used that intelligence to win battles, to save convoys, to plan invasions, and they kept it secret from an enemy that was absolutely certain their system couldn't be broken. That's the story of Enigma, a story of mathematical brilliance and human error, of technical achievement and moral compromise, of secrets kept and lives saved. It's one of the greatest intelligence triumphs in history, and it's a reminder that no system is truly unbreakable. No matter how good your mathematics, if humans are involved, there's always a weakness, always a way in. You just need someone smart enough to find it. The Germans thought Enigma was unbreakable. The Allies proved them wrong, and that one secret, more than almost anything else, helped win the war. Remember that. The next time someone tells you something is impossible, remember Enigma. Remember that impossible just means nobody's figured it out yet. Remember Alan Turing, sitting in a cold mansion in England, looking at a problem everyone said couldn't be solved, and solving it anyway. That's the power of human ingenuity. That's why we study history. Not just to remember the battles, but to remember the breakthroughs. The moments when someone looked at the impossible and said, "Watch me." Germany thought Enigma was unbreakable. They were wrong, and that mistake helped lose them the war.